Okay, well, there's nothing else we can do at that point.
Yeah, no, it's Uconnect. I just want to make sure that we're looking at. Cool.
Really? welcome back everyone. Let's get started. Third, or let's say second and a half lecture on graphs and trees. Before we start discussing graphs and trees, your projects, milestones with you, and you're supposed to meet with your TAs this week. So you should have received an email from your TAs. Remember, this is required for you to attend the meeting with your TA, but it's also really supposed to be helpful for you guys so that we can look at your milestone together with you and give you like feedback on what you need to do to get a great grade for your final project submission. I know that Minjia is out of town this week. I think she's met with all her teams already last week, but all the other TAs are here, and you should be responding to their emails that you already have received. Questions about projects, milestones, finals, meetings, anything like that?
Just one question. I wonder if anyone else has run into it. Our data set is pretty large.
Yep.
And so our viz was through the GitHub pages was working until we started doing a lot of data stuff. Now will not display. I don't know if that's a common thing or not because we're importing so much. These CSV files are quite large.
Yeah. And now, what do you mean by now it won't display?
Well, now our headings and stuff where our vizzes are show up, but the actual vizzes do not show up anymore.
Okay. And that was the problem already with your milestone, or after your milestone?
It's kind of pretty right with
Okay.
milestone. It works fine on the computer, but just it will not show up. It won't.
Okay. I think we'll have to take a look at this individually. The simple answer is, can you sample your data? Or can you subset it? Can you make it smaller? Or can you put a server somewhere where you use database spaces or something like that? But yeah, like you need to talk to your meme officers or with your TA about how to manage this. And if it doesn't work on GitHub pages, but still on the TA's computer, that's fine. Okay, other questions about projects? Great, so let's do a quick recap about what we talked in graph and tree visualization. Remember, like any visualization technique, we have data and tasks. It kind of helps us decide which graphical representation to use. We talked about different types of tasks. We will revisit those today extensively when we talk about multivariate network visualization. So attribute-based tasks and topology-based tasks are the high-level tasks. This is a paper that summarizes these tasks. And then we talked about 3 different types of graph representations. Explicit representations, which are also known as node link diagrams, adjacency matrices, and implicit visualizations. We haven't talked yet about implicit visualizations, but we have covered node link and matrices. And then we will, like today, we'll cover implicit at the end of the lecture, and we will cover multivariate networks in between. So explicit graph visualizations are those node link diagrams. And here we distinguish 3 main layouts: a free layout, style layout, and fixed layout. Free layout is where I position the nodes so that I can best see what the structure of the graph is. Style layout is I have some pattern to actually position the nodes. And fixed layout is I have the positions of the nodes given. That is common if you want to visualize graphs on top of maps, or, for example, graphs in the context of, let's say, anything spatial like a body scan or brain MRI, anything like that. We talked about that node link layout. For free layouts, we can define these different criteria, but these criteria are like, everybody would agree that those are good criteria individually, but we also talked about that they conflict. And so finding an optimal graph layout is an NP hard problem, and we usually use approximations such as these force-directed layouts. Force-directed layouts are kind of like a simple physics-based model where we have the edges represent the springs and pull 2 nodes together, and each of the nodes is a little magnet that repulses each other. And how this works is that you calculate the force on a vertex in a loop that is the sum of the pairwise repulsion of all nodes. So this is kind of an expensive step because I have to calculate the repulsion between all combinations of nodes, and then the attraction between the connected nodes. That's usually much less expensive, but of course depends on how, like, what the average degree of your networks is. And then you move your vertex by a certain, like a constant multiplied by this force and you continue doing this in a loop until you reach some kind of equilibrium, hence, or meaning that your C multiplied by force is close to 0. And so this was like a little video where you can see the initial random state of the network and how, like, in iterative cycles, we arrive at a good layout. We talked about that these layouts have some kind of like other properties that we need to implement in practice, things like having damping in the center of gravity, or also making sure that they fit within a view. We talked about that those networks are computationally quite expensive. We have n to the power of 3 n cubed as computational complexity. And so that means that we have, like, this is fairly limited in terms of what we can do interactively. Also, they have a tendency to create these giant hairballs, which are not particularly useful once you have seeded a certain number of nodes. And then we talked about some kind of strategies of how we could approach. We could use these kinds of algorithms to make this a little bit more scalable. And one approach would be kind of like a divide and conquer approach, like it's very common, like paradigm in algorithms. So instead of like doing this pairwise or this like calculating the force between all possible nodes, we only calculate the forces between a subset of nodes, and we choose the subset of the nodes smartly by, for example, running a clustering algorithm first. And then we do this, the force directed layout within the clusters and between the clusters, but not between the nodes of different clusters. We talked about some other layout strategies like orthogonal layouts and how we could create them. Talked about why this is not a great idea to do this in 3D. Restricted layouts, they have, like, they're not necessarily, let's say, easy to make sense of unless you have a good node ordering. One strategy to alleviate this cluttering problem here was this edge bundling strategy. In this case, we used the hierarchical structure behind the network to route those edges smoothly across, like along basically a tree that you draw in the background. And then we talked about how we could do this for force-directed, for fixed layouts where we don't have, or for fixed layouts where we don't have such a hierarchical structure that we could leverage. And the idea here is to kind of like partition the links into tiny segments and then use a force-directed algorithms on those tiny segments. We talked about supernodes and aggregation and how that is useful to kind of like make sense of very large networks. Here's an example of where like movement data within the US is kind of abstracted into a couple of major cities like Montana, or areas, let's say, New York, Washington, Montana, Arizona, Florida, and we see the transitions between them and within them, but we don't see the individual nodes. So this is like a classical example of creating supernodes and showing what is going on between those nodes and within those nodes, but not visualizing every detail about them. Trees are fairly simple to lay out. There's the Reingold-Tilford layout, which is kind of what you see here in a linear or radial fashion. And there's many other layout algorithms, but we don't want to go too much into detail on that. Then we talked about matrices. And adjacency matrices, like what are the pros and cons of adjacency matrices? Remember?
They're not great for visualizing paths.
Exactly. So they're not great at visualizing paths. I can only see neighborhoods well. What are they good for?
They're good for discrete lookups.
Exactly, for simple lookups. And if you think about attributes, what are they good for? They're good for edge attributes. So I could, for example, easily color the cells by an attribute, and then we could like quickly see these edge attributes. So I'm going to skip over some of this stuff here. Like as in every matrix, ordering is important for these adjacency matrices. And also like a benefit of adjacency matrices compared to node link diagrams is that they work much better with highly connected graphs. So for example, if you have a graph that's almost completely connected, then you should really consider an adjacency matrix over a node link diagram. Okay, I think this is roughly where we stopped. Yeah, so today I want to start with talking about multivariate networks. And as you'll notice, this is kind of like one of my core research areas, so I'll show you a couple of the stuff that we've been doing in this space. So what is a multivariate network? Consider this challenge here. You have a network, and then you have a lot of attributes about these nodes or the edges. So it could be something like, here we have a small network of, let's say, authors, and then we have these nodes, the name of the node, then a year, this number of citation, a journal, anything, any attribute you could envision about a node. It could be like the year of birth for a person, or the school that they graduated from, or anything like that. So really there is an infinite set of attributes that could make sense to explore in the context of a network. And so the challenge here is really to consider both the topology and the attributes simultaneously. For example, I want to identify a clique that I see in a network. Is this clique all people of the same age? Are they all at the same school? Are they friends because they know each other from school? Do they have all similar degrees? Or you could ask questions such as, are they all affiliated with the same terrorist network? Or are they all in the same biological process, and so on. These are the kinds of questions that you want to address when you look at multivariate networks. And so it turns out that attributes can also very often influence topology. For example, if you think about biological networks, we have these canonical networks that we kind of like draw for a whole organism, but then we have variation in organisms. So for example, a gene can be mutated, or a drug could target a specific gene. And then we have things like path along this network can be slowed or blocked. Think of traffic. The best route to go home from this lecture depends on what the traffic pattern is, right? And of course, biological networks depend on many different factors. And so we kind of like need to look at those together. And this is kind of like two spectrums of visualizing networks. So we can either show just individual nodes or a small network, or show all nodes in a large network. That's like one axis here. And then we have show all attributes or many attributes, or show selected attributes or few attributes. And so the point here is that we kind of like have a reasonable handle on doing stuff in this triangle. So we can either show small networks with many attributes, or many attributes, or few attributes with large networks, but we can't really show many attributes for large networks very well. Not very surprising, but essentially most of the multivariate network visualization techniques will fall somewhere in that space. And so we're currently actually working on a state-of-the-art report on multivariate network visualization strategies, and these are the major classes of multivariate network techniques that we have identified. So first are matrices, and as I already mentioned, matrices are good for edge attributes, but can also be used for node attributes. Then on-node encoding, small multiples, multiple coordinated views, and layout adaption. And I'll go into those now. So we talked about matrices. It's easy to encode edge attributes in the cells, for example, by color. But you could also simply do something like we do up here, that you show like a little bar chart next to each of the nodes in the rows or columns. So that means that matrices are kind of like easy to juxtapose with a tabular representation of your data. And we have all the common pros and cons of using these matrices. For on-node encoding, I would say that's the most common way to visualize multivariate networks, and most commonly you see like a single attribute is color-coded. This is really ideal if I have only a single attribute. This is ideal for understanding the relationship of that attribute to the network, because it's kind of like easy to see the relationship of, let's say, color patterns to topological patterns. But it turns out to be quite tricky for multiple attributes, so if I have more than one attribute to show. And so here are some approaches that try to do that for multiple attributes, like little nested pie charts on top of a network, or little nested line graphs or bar graphs, or or these box plots, or these like bar charts with error plots, and so on. And these are all from real systems. And so I would basically recommend that you use on-node encoding just only if you have a single attribute, or can have like a meaningful summary of a single attribute. But I would not necessarily recommend to use them when you want to show multiple attributes at the same time. For aggregates, you kind of like the example that I showed earlier. You now when I talk about these embedded visualizations here, for these aggregates supernodes, you have actually the benefit by using these supernodes instead of individual nodes. You bring down the number of nodes a lot, and that means you have more space to visualize the nodes, and that means you can do things like having a little scatter plot or histograms or even like a tree map in those nodes. And so if you have very few nodes, what I just said about using a single attribute only, of course, does not hold. But if you have anything more than 30 or 40 nodes, this is likely to going to be not, like you're not going to have enough screen space to pull this off. A technique that we've frequently talked about are small multiples. Who remembers what small multiples are?
Like the same, you're showing the same visualization with like different things highlighted.
Exactly. So in this case here, we had looked at this picture before when we talked about small multiples. In this case here, we have the same network 8 times here, overlaid with experimental data from 8 different experiments. Similar approach here. Instead of having 8, we only have 4 here. And then we have a detailed pullout in both of those cases. So small multiples are fine to do these things, but can you spot the 5 differences here? So the plane, everybody got the plane? The number of the bus changed, and so on. So here are the dials on the Big Ben are different. There's an airplane. The top of the lamppost is missing. The number on the bus changed, and the shirt color of this person changed. Right. So the point here is really those figures, these different images. They're supposed to be riddles, and that means they're hard to do, right? And very like this is exactly the process that you have to go through if you do a comparison of small multiples. So just be wary of this problem. And of course, this is a little bit, let's say, the changes here are much less salient than they could be in a visualization, but the same principles apply. A decent solution to do attributes at the same time as network is multiple coordinate views. And we talked about multiple coordinate views before. But like the typical example is that you have something like a network visualization, and then you show some stats about this network, or have a table associated with the network. Or here we have a parallel coordinates plot that is associated with the elements in that network. So how can I now identify the attributes of an individual nodes in any of those approaches? I need to use some linking and brushing, some highlighting, right? So if I hover over a node and highlight a node in the network, I can also show where that node is in any of these other visualizations. And so that implies that we can basically ask questions about the attributes of a part of the network that we're interested in, but it's not that we see all of it at the same time. So it requires interactivity, it requires iteration, and it's kind of difficult to spot like high-level interaction effects between the network and the attributes. However, this is kind of like the benefit of using multiple coordinate views here is that I can use like optimal visualization techniques for the attributes and for the network separately. So if I want to use a good force-directed layout algorithm and a good attribute visualization, I can do that. I don't have to compromise. So pros and cons, but it's a reasonable strategy for many cases. The last category that I want to talk about is layout adaption. And that's kind of like a special case where what you do is you adapt the node position in a node link diagram so that it's well suited for attribute visualization. So that's a strategy. There's like many flavors to it, and there's the spectrum from is the layout driven mostly by the attributes, or is the layout driven mostly by the topology? And that's kind of like the spectrum that we can work with here, and there's many different techniques along that spectrum. So one example here, the most extreme one, is this fixed layout, where I position the nodes only by the attribute values. So let's suppose we have this layout of the map of the United States that we saw earlier, where we have like how are people moving between the United States. I'm positioning the nodes based on the latitude and longitude. And then I'm drawing the edges on top of them. And this is kind of like what this technique here, graph dice, does, but also for like a more general use case than just for geospatial data. So I'll show you this.
The user can focus on a subset of nodes by creating graphic queries of different colors. She makes a lasso selection to create and refine selections through usual Boolean operations, as in Photoshop. Multiple queries can be activated at a given time to mark different groups of interest, like the strong connected communities the user has highlighted in this co-authorship network. The user can then explore how the community actors are spread from the point of view of other attributes by selecting a new plot in the navigation matrix. There is a 3D animated transition between the nodes and the lengths of the current plot to the new plot, as well as for the convex hulls that correspond to the queries, keeping one attribute dimension consistent during the animation. The user also has the option to control the speed of the 3D animation by invoking.
So does this remind you of anything? I showed a very similar video. Yes. That was basically for scalable matrices. And here, basically, this is a separate paper by the same group using the same technology. But what they've done now is instead of just using the scatter plot dots, they also show the edges between them. And they did a couple of other things in that paper. But essentially, my point about this is not so much the transitions and the matrix and so on here, but the idea of positioning nodes solely based on attribute values. So if you do that, you can really focus on the relationship of a limited number of attributes, but of course you also have a hard time reading the topology. So like up here in this example, for example, we see that we can't really understand the network too well. Down here, where we have the nodes spaced apart, we can see, okay, there is not really a connection from this node here to this node here, but there are connections between the rest of the nodes. So that's easy to read. Then we can also apply a linearization strategy where we create a layout that enables juxtaposition with attribute visualization. And so here's an example by Mariah Meyer, who is also faculty here in Utah, for how she applied this idea. This is a very simple biological pathway, metabolic pathway. You start out at at a metabolite, then you go here through a branch, and then you have a cycle. And so what they do is they create a new visual encoding for this network. So they kind of like uncycle this cycle, they splice in this branch, and then they visualize these relationships here, like these edges are kind of like encoded up here with these like black arcs, and then a cycle is shown with this particular glyph here. So we know that this is a cycle. So they kind of like have abstracted away the topological features of the network into an encoding along a single axis, right? And now you can use the space to its right to plot attributes. And so here they're plotting these dot plots that you can see here, but also these black bars encode data. And so that allows us to very easily use data encoding. And of course, it could show a lot more data here about each of those nodes, but the principle is to kind of abstract, to create an abstract representation of a network that's completely linear. So, can anybody spot any downsides of this approach? What do you think if I just showed you this graph? Would you know how the network looks like? So, okay, you have to learn it, right? But for this particular example, you can probably learn it. You can learn this is like a cycle, this is a branch, and so on. But it doesn't really work for complicated and larger networks too well. Then if you get in cycles that have cycles or branches that have branches, it kind of gets tricky to do. To kind of like address this problem, we've developed a technique where we do selective linearization. And so here we start out with a given network. Like basically, we have a node link layout here, and then we let a user choose which path to linearize. And in this case, we show that path in a separate view. So this is kind of like a hybrid multiple coordinated view layout adaption approach, where we like take one selected path by user, but show also like still the path in its order and show context. For example, we see that B goes into A, and this node here leads out to Z, and that there's an incoming edge and an outgoing edge for E. And then we can use this like linearized path to visualize attributes about each of those nodes. We could do multiple like data sets or different groups and so on. We could juxtapose this also with data that is not associated with nodes in the network. So here's an example of how we implemented this for this pathway networks. You would start by selecting a sequence of 4 nodes, and then the system would extract that. And now what we're showing here is this path is extracted here, and then we have it associated with 2 different data sets. And each of those data sets, like one of them is a copy number data set, the other is a gene expression data set. It doesn't really matter what it is, but each of these data sets shows now about 30 data values. So I'm showing you about 60 data values for each of those nodes for the nodes in that path. And then I could dynamically extend that path, and then that would automatically also extend that network. And then I can see that here, down here is a node that has kind of odd attributes. All of the blue bars are higher, and then we have a few of those red outliers here. And so I might want to study that. And so we've actually discovered a couple of interesting network effects in some biological data sets that we can visualize with this tool, with this technique, that are really hard to see with other approaches. Another idea to do this selective linearization is not letting the user choose which path to linearize, but letting the user to submit a query. So that would be, if we say, hey, I want to understand all of the connections between those 2 actors. Let's suppose this is like 2 people that I know that have something in common, but I don't actually know how they're connected. I could submit a query like this, and what we do then is we query for all of the paths about those people, and then we show those paths as a ranked list. And below each of these nodes, we can now use the same trick that we did before by showing bars about the nodes. So here now we are showing attributes about the nodes in this linearized space. But what's unique about this technique is that we can also rank those paths. So for example, we can rank the path by the length of the path, right? So those 2 have the same length, so they would be tied. But we can also bring in attributes into that ranking. So we could say, for example, like if we have people, we want to look at a network of young people, and we could use age as a factor in our ranking here. And then if we determine that one of those is, like one of those paths is like better fitting to my criteria, I could kind of like move that path to the top. And so here's an example of that system in action. This is also implemented in D3 and uses a Neo4j database in the background. We've looked for a connection between those people. Here we see an overview of all of the connections. Here is the list of the path and the attribute visualizations below them. And then we can do things like make those queries a little bit more complex. So we can say, hey, exclude anybody. We'll see whether sometimes Mac doesn't show me the progress bar of the video. Anyway, we can kind of like switch to an advanced query interface and like formulate pretty complicated queries on what kind of path we're interested in, and then we can also rank these paths based on the attributes or based on any kind of function that you would like to write. We can also linearize trees, which is actually fairly straightforward if you think about it. Like here is an example where we applied this linearization strategy to trees of family relationships. So, like, who's interested in like family genealogy? Anybody here who does this kind of stuff? A couple of people. Yeah. So when you like investigate your ancestry, you basically build up a graph, right? These are my parents, these are my siblings, these are my grandparents, uncles, and so on. And it turns out these kind of family structures are also useful to study diseases, like especially these like low penetrance, or let's say these very complex diseases such as diabetes or heart disease or cancer, where we don't have like a single clear reason of why people get those diseases. And so our collaborators here in Utah use the Utah Population Database. Who's heard of the Utah Population Database? A couple of people. So Utah Population Database is like a unique resource for studying these kind of population health data effects based on records from the Mormon Church. Turns out that probably everybody in this room is in this database. Like, if you have a Utah license, you are already in the database, even if you're just recently moved to Utah. And if you're from Utah, you probably are in this database, as are your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on, all the way back to the 1700s. And this database doesn't only contain the family relationships, but it also contains all of your medical records if you've ever been to any Intermountain hospital. And so that means that we have an extremely rich data set about those people. And so here is one of those pedigrees as they are commonly used to study Mendelian monogene diseases. So what we're looking at here are, we have a founder couple, and they had 5 children in that case. The squares here are males, the circles are females. We have 3 generations. And then here, this son of the founder couple has married somebody who is not, obviously not a sibling. And then they had 3 children. And these 2 here had 4 children, 2 of them girls, 3 of them girls, 1 of them a boy. And then usually what you do in these diagrams is you color code one of the nodes by a certain disease or phenotype that you're interested in. So the project that we've been working on here is suicide. And so we were studying the effects, families with a very high incidence of suicide. And the hypothesis behind that is that there's a genetic component to suicide. And that's a multivariate graph visualization problem, because just knowing that these people have committed suicide isn't particularly helpful. We also want to understand what was their age, what was their sex, what was their race, were they bipolar, were they depressed, did they have asthma, did they have obesity, were they schizophrenic, what caused their death, which weapon have they used when they committed suicide, and so on. All of these factors, they play a role in understanding suicide better. And so this was a simple example before, but this is what a typical family looks like. Here we have 400 people in this genealogy. That's an actual suicide pedigree from Utah. And if you now want to visualize 5 or 6 or 15 attributes about each of those nodes, you cannot even read the attributes that I showed here, right? So we need some better strategy to visualize what is going on in this tree. And so this is a tool that we developed to help with that. And it has 2 components: this decycled linearized graph, and then an attribute table. And this is again a similar strategy of finding a smart layout to linearize a network and then juxtapose it with a tabular visualization of attributes. And so it turns out that families are, it happens that people marry their second cousin or third cousin. And so we do have cycles in these trees. And we kind of need to remove these cycles for our layout purposes. And we remove those cycles by duplicating nodes. So now instead of having 7 once, we have 7 twice in this network. But that allows us to do the layout. And then use a simple linearization layout, and then we can associate that with the attributes in the table. Okay, so this is how this looks like in the system. What you will notice here are 2 things. A, I actually can't show that many people. I said it's a problem to not be able to show 400 people, but I really haven't solved that problem here. I'm showing only 30 people here maybe. And then we also have a lot of missing data. So it turns out most studies of families, you have pretty good data about the cases you study and maybe their immediate relatives. But the great-great-grandparent from 1700, you actually don't have an ICD code that tells you whether he was depressed or not. And so, very common to see like sparse data in generations further back. And so to address that, we have developed a couple of aggregation strategies. So for example, here, like remember we talked about degree of interest-based aggregation in one of the lectures in the first half of the semester. Here we define the degree of interest to be suicide in that case. And we say node 3 and 6 are suicide cases. We want to guarantee that we see everything we know about those cases. But for the rest, please show me a summary. And that's what we do here. So we create this layout where each of these nodes, 3 and 6, has guaranteed its own row, and everybody else is summarized like the best we can in other rows. So here, for example, we have the nodes 1, 2, 7, and 5 to share a row, and then we visualize the distribution of those attributes. So how does this look like? Here we have the two. Here we have like this here would be the one, starting with the one here. That's a case where we have a suicide, and we can see that this person's had a very high BMI. So this is an unambiguous, like a single person. But here we actually summarize 9 people, and then we show these like either like stacked bar charts for categorical attributes, so we can see that they're roughly half male-female, that most of them are actually dead. And that actually a fair number of them are bipolar. And then here we have a distribution of the BMI of those people, so we can see that most people had a like BMI in the middle range, but we had 2 outliers here. And so by using these dot plots and jitter, we can actually show fairly well a number of people at the same time. Turns out that we sometimes need a more aggressive approach where we don't show attributes about people that we don't care so much about. And that's when we use this hiding approach. So here we show only data for the person of interest, and sometimes that results in also empty rows. And so this is how that looks like. Now here I'm showing 2 different families, and I'm actually let me show you a live demo. So this is anonymized data, so don't worry about privacy here, and like of course real data is only accessible to the researchers that do these kinds of studies. But so this would be what a tree looks like with 121 people if I don't have any aggregation. So you see I have to scroll a fair bit. Here we see like a complicated family relationship where we have one man having children with 2 women, 2 children each. And then the man has committed suicide at 25. And this woman here died at 27. Whereas this person here is still alive and is currently 42 years old. Then we see here, this family had 4 children, and the youngest daughter actually committed suicide at 41. But so now the aggregation techniques, here is what would happen if I go to aggregate. Now I see each of those like cases of interest as individual rows, but everybody else is aggregated. And if I do the hide mode, I basically really look at the set of leaves that I care about. And then I can do things like sort by age, for example, or sort by personality disorder. I can also look at multiple families here and see whether there's patterns that bridge families or that go across families. So how this tool is used is really to identify people that they consider have like a high probability of being like genetically associated suicide. Because it turns out that, for example, young people, let's say, if somebody commits suicide at 75, the chance of this being genetically caused is very low. It's more likely that environmental, social factors, or maybe this person got sick, contributed to this person committing suicide. However, if you have a family where like 4 daughters across just like, let's say, 2 parent couples have all committed suicide at a very young age, the likelihood of this being genetic is quite high. And so they use this tool to kind of like identify those kinds of cases and then do like an analysis of shared genomic sequences to identify genes that are in some way involved in, or gene variants that are in some way involved in suicide. So, like, this was an amazing project to do from the application perspective, but then of course we asked our questions, could we do something like Lineage for general multivariate networks? And it turns out that we can. Who knows what a spanning tree is? Can anybody explain what a spanning tree is?
It's a tree that connects every vertex with each other. So there's a path from one vertex to any other vertex.
Exactly. So basically, a spanning tree is you start out, like you have a graph, you start out with one node, and then you make sure to include every node through at most one vertex. And so you create essentially a tree that traverses the graph, but you don't necessarily include every edge. And so it turns out that those spanning trees are very useful to explore large graphs. So here is a paper that's called Tree Plus, where they use these spanning trees to successively navigate like a large graph. And here is like a spanning tree approach that was also projected into hyperbolic space from '98. And so what we did is we looked at those spanning trees and applied some of the tricks that we did earlier with linearization, and now visualize the attributes about those people. And so now we have created like a technique that allows you to explore a very big network with specific questions and attributes about them. So how does the spanning tree work? So here we start out with node A. A would be a root, and we create the spanning tree, as you can see on the right, from that network. And then we linearize this as you saw it earlier, and then we visualize the attributes about them. So if we have a spanning tree, we have missing edges, right? So there are some edges that are not in this network now. And we can actually, like, we know exactly how many edges are missing in a subnetwork. And note this is also like, we are only looking at a small part of a very large graph here. So we could have, like, in this case, the root has 0 hidden edges, so all the neighbors of the root are directly connected to the root, but node B here has 2 hidden edges. And node B has a degree of 4 in the network overall. So there's other nodes that are not in this subnetwork that are connected to B. We can then do this combination with an adjacency matrix of the spanning tree to visualize the relationship of any of those nodes to any other nodes that I care about. And that can also include nodes that are not in our spanning tree. So node F here, for example, isn't actually in a spanning tree. So that was our original graph here. And we can show the relationship in this adjacency matrix. And then next to this adjacency matrix, we can again visualize an attribute table. What we also do here is when we highlight a node, we show those 2 hidden edges on hover, so that we can kind of like resolve any of those ambiguities. And so let me just show a little demo of this. Who watches Game of Thrones? Most people here. So I can either demo it with academic researchers in their papers or Game of Thrones characters. I'm going to show us with Game of Thrones characters. So let's suppose we're looking at Eddard Stark. So now I've added Eddard. Like, this is a network where we have about 15,000 nodes and 20,000 edges of characters, like characters of Game of Thrones, the noble houses, battles, regions, the books, whether they're knight or not, locations, cultures, and some other attributes. In addition to attributes about those people or places or books and so on. So this is a data set that we synthesized from a couple of fan databases online. So it's not going to be exhaustive, and you're not going to see every relationship here, but you'll see a fair bit of things. And so Eddard Stark here is a node. We see he has 12 edges. His name, we see his gender, we see this here shows which book chapter did he die in, and it was a fairly, Spoilers. I guess everybody who cares has seen that by now. So he died in chapter 65 of the book. Now we can expand and look at all the neighborhood of Eddard Stark. And not surprisingly, we see his wife, Catelyn Stark, here. We see his sister, Catelyn Tully, and then he is mentioned in all of these different books. He's a noble. He is, of course, associated with Robb Stark. And so here you see, zoom in a bit, how Robb Stark is connected, like he's the son of Eddard Stark, so not surprisingly, he's also widely connected with his neighbors, right? And Robb Stark is actually a more important character in the book. So if you look at his affiliation with where he was involved, you can see that he was actually like in many different battles here, and he's connected like through those battles with many other people. So we could say, well, I don't care so much about the battles, and I could filter them out. So now this is much. What happened?
Do you want to zoom in on Rob?
Yeah, but I don't. Oh, here he is. I don't know why he. Well, this is like research prototype.
I'll have to reload.
So there was a bug.
It's a feature.
Please send bug reports to my student Carolina. So. Okay, so we could filter by any node. I'm not going to show it now. Here we have like attributes of like which year was that battle in, and we can use these like sorting approaches. And then we can like the Siege of Raventree. We can explore what are the neighborhoods of that. We can look now. We've found Jaime Lannister. We can see Jaime Lannister has been involved in many of those operations. We can now say, okay, Jaime Lannister is really who we care about. Let's make him the root. Now we can see all of the relationship with Jaime Lannister. We can see that there's more edges, or more nodes hidden down here, and so on. And so basically, this is like an interactive exploration where you can ask questions about individuals and neighborhoods and at some level of distance from a very large graph database. Sometimes you want to ask questions such as what is the, like, you don't care so much about the direct relationship between people, but more about the distance. And so here I've now chosen a layout where I show only how far are they away from the root. And so you see, like, these are all the battles and books and houses that are once removed from the root, in this case Jaime Lannister, and then these are all the battles and people and locations and battles that are twice removed from the root. So this is what we call level layout, and we can combine this again with aggregation. And now we have like an overview. Jaime Lannister was directly involved in 5 battles here, was like at a distance of 2, he was involved in all of these other battles here. And then we could say, do again degree of interest-based querying and ask questions such as, we care about battles that were in a later year. And so now we have revealed that there is these 2 battles that occurred within the brush that I've just set here. And so you can use this tool for any kinds of graph, and I've used it for co-author networks, for biological networks, and for these kind of like complex social networks like Game of Thrones, which are actually quite similar to what you would use in an intelligence analysis scenario where you have locations, cities, places, people, and so on. Okay, so the conclusion of this is that linearization and juxtaposition are good options for visualizing multivariate graphs, and also that many tasks are local, so that you care more about specific nodes and neighborhoods than about the whole overview of the network. And then you can use this search from context, expand and demand principle also for multivariate network visualization. So the last part about visualizing multivariate networks is we should think a little bit more about edge attributes. So first, like I've said this a couple of times already, the best choice to visualize edge attributes are matrices, because in this case here, the clusters or the clicks are color-coded, but I could also, and they are also, well, if you look closely, they are also, we have saturation used here. And the saturation shows us how, like in this case, how frequently those 2 people are co-connected. So that works well. A matrix is usually your first choice if you want to visualize edge attributes. But sometimes, especially for sparse networks, they're not the best idea. And so what you would use are like typically what you try to do initially if you want to visualize edge attributes are to use one of those four attributes here. For quantitative, you could use width. For ordinal, you could use saturation. And for nominal, you could use either style or color. However, it's fairly tricky to do most of those things because edges, they tend to, like, there's a lot of edge crossings often. And then how many, like, let's take this example here. How many numerical variables do you think you can really distinguish here? Like 10 maybe, yeah, that's already generous. Yeah. And so here's an example of an edge visualization from a biological use case where they try to use edge width and labels to visualize. You can think of this like a linear fixed layout and then edges between all of those. This is like, again, I don't want to talk about the biology too much, but in practice these edge attributes, to visualize them directly, are very limited. And so here is a simplified example and one solution that we have tried to approach with this edge attribute problem. If we take something like that, what we actually could do is we could represent an edge like this here as this like little scatter plot. And now we can show all of the attributes that we have about this edge in this little scatter plot. So we use position here. So we can see that some of these edge attributes are low, two of them are fairly high. And we, instead of showing this edge here, we kind of like show this indirection here. And then we can make this like for more complicated cases as well. So here we have like a network starting from here, going to here, and one from here going to here. And we have these like indirect encodings here. And so that kind of like allows you to really look at the attributes in detail and compare them. You can also divide them up by group. For example, I have like two conditions that I want to compare. You can do something like that. And so you could use a technique like that where you give the edges their own dedicated space to visualize attribute about them. But of course, that's a very specific use case, and it's also like a special kind of network, right? This is a directed acyclic graph. It doesn't really work quite as nicely for general networks. In practice, this is how that looks like when we look at this kind of data. Here we're looking at like 500 samples or more for each of these edge attributes, and we can see quite clear patterns in that case. So here's like the whole system, and again, I don't want to talk too much about what this is all about, but what I really want to emphasize is like this view up here where we look at these attributes about the edges. Okay, so last graph chapter is trees, and for that I have an exercise. So I would like you to think about how you can visualize like a folder on your hard drive. And what I want you to do, like your folder on a hard drive has nested folders, and in those folders you have files. These files are the size. The folder has the size of the sum of all its files and so on. And so that's a tree with node attributes. And I would like you to try to sketch two different visualizations to show both the directory structure and the size of the directories and the contained files. And so here's a very simple example that you could use to sketch that.
Yeah, I'll see one for me is like squares. So essentially, you kind of start the box or
Anybody else missing one of these? Bueller? Okay.
yeah, it's like selective linearization. What were you talking? Oh yeah, maybe you can. Yeah, so I was thinking I'd probably do that. I think maybe like Aggregates and do this too. I was thinking I'd rather show you like or like because we also want to know probably like the characters of the file. I feel like that'd be interesting. Like, what if the directory has yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of what I was thinking. Like, yeah, lots of little. Well, you could click on the word. Maybe it's, you know, what if you did it like this New York Times? I mean, it doesn't bubble charts right now. It'd be cool if it'd be like, it's like a group, like this, and see like the database would be like this, and then each of these would be like something, and the size would be different. I don't know. Yeah, so my fast name is pretty good. So it's one of the directories. It's probably as yeah, let's do that. I can play my to make sure like you go past oh, this is so like that one more pass. Fast enough. Like all the data. Yeah.
Okay, anybody want to share the ideas? Where's an interesting design? Like who's drawn a node link diagram? Raise your hand. A lot of people, yes. So one simple solution, of course, would be to do the node link diagram. Like basically take this structure here and then maybe like draw links here to make that a little bit more explicit, and then draw bar charts or something like that to encode the file size, right? That would be a simple solution. Who has a different solution?
From that genetics example you showed, it had like a circle, a little bar, and then subcircles. So I was thinking of just making the first circle there, and then a red, green, and blue bar based on what file size you're looking for that you can search in, and then just the subcircles underneath that.
Okay, so you have kind of a nested layout for like the hierarchy of the tree, if I understand you correctly. Okay, cool. Anybody else have an approach?
Nested circles where the arc is the arc is the file unit size, and you have multiple layers of those with the files that are contained in that folder.
Yeah. So like a nested circle approach, and then you have the links that show the relationship between the root and its children, basically, if I understand you correctly.
It's like literally
Okay.
circles, nested circles.
Okay. So I see that there's this idea of nestedness appears a lot, which does make a lot of sense for trees. Anybody have other approaches? Yeah.
I did like an on-node pie chart, basically, so when you look at it, Well, you showed one on the on-node.
Yes, as a bad, like a terrible example.
Well, that's what I...
Yeah, that's fine. So, who has ever run out of hard drive space in their computer? Like most people, right? So that's annoying, and you want to kind of like not spend a ton of time cleaning up your hard drive. You want to identify the files that you don't need anymore, but that also need a lot of space. Has anybody used any visualization tools to do that in the past? What did you?
Windows stack.
What's the name?
Windows stack. It shows like a nested, just box layout.
Okay. So I know Sequoia View for Windows and Grand Perspective for Mac that do this kind of nested box layout. This is what you mean?
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah. So that's what's called a tree map. And that's kind of a fairly popular visualization for implicit tree layouts. This is my like essentially home directory here. And basically everything on this side of the tree here is my photos folder. And this here is my work folder, or it's like projects folder. Here are the lectures, so you can see that the Viz lectures are actually quite big files. And you can see that each of the, like, what do I see here? What are the squares? The squares encode the size, that's correct, but what is, like, if you think about the nodes, these are special types of nodes. Are these the files or the directories? It's the files, right? So if you look at the tree, like this, what we actually see here are only the 4 leaves here. So let's suppose this were like this here would be like the encoding for the root node, a big rectangle. Okay, and then to encode the 2 nodes here, I would split it up once. Okay, and now let's suppose that one of those nodes is much smaller than the other one. Now I would split this up like that. Now this is like a leaf, this is a leaf, and then here those 2 nodes are about of the equal size. We could split it up like that. Now I've created a very simple tree map. It's what's tricky to see here. The individual files are tricky to see, but I guess the idea is if a file is small, you don't care so much about it. The levels, exactly. So everything that's in the backbone of the tree is kind of tricky to see here. You kind of need to use interaction. So like here you see 3 levels of hierarchy. This is like 2009 from a trip to Scotland that I did in the Highlands, kind of like the nested the nested hierarchy levels here. So it's tricky to see the structure, but of course, for operations on the leaf set, this is quite a powerful technique. And I use this like a lot when I need to clean up my hard drive. There are different solutions, and we call these layouts in general implicit layouts for trees. And they're called implicit because we don't have explicit edges. So there's no edge here at all. They are simply, the hierarchy is simply encoded by smart choice of layout. And so we have the tree map here on the left, the sunburst in the middle, and the icicle plot on the right, which are by far not the only ones, but those are kind of like the most well-known, the most sensible implicit layouts. So this is the tree map example that I just sketched here. I think this is fairly simple, I guess, now. I think from a historical perspective, the interesting piece is what you want to do is you want to make those leaf nodes as square as possible. Because if you make them like slivers, it gets really hard to see and label. And so the original tree map, as you can see here on the right, they created those like thin slices, and only when people found algorithms that would create these more rectangular shapes, the tree maps really take off in popularity. And so here would be like the original tree map algorithm, and this would be after people have developed this squarifying approach to that. And so here is kind of like an illustration of how that works, how they kind of like the idea behind that algorithm, and the idea behind that is simply like I do a kind of like an iterative step. I start out with step one, try to place another one. Then I add the second square here. I continue, like I always evaluate the alternative. Like here, I'm adding now a third square, and then I try alternative placements, and I calculate the aspect ratio, and whichever has the better aspect ratio is what you use, and then you continue in an iterative fashion. You always reject something which has like a bad aspect ratio, you split it up instead, and you continue going like that. So that's how you arrive at these squarified tree maps, and those are much nicer to see and understand. This is what I just showed you, what I drew here, and what I showed you in the tool on my Mac. But people have also experimented with trying to show the structure better by framing it. However, the problem with framing is, first, you kind of like use space that you would otherwise use for the attributes, so you're not completely true to the size of the nodes anymore. And it also, like, it's a little bit better to see here, but it's still not completely unambiguous to see the structure in the tree. I think to kill that, yeah. Or well, you can make those tree maps zoomable, but that's actually broken. Well, okay. I have other examples here. I've showed you in perspective. If you want to do this on Windows, there is this tool Sequoia View that does that on Windows, and that's actually the tool by the people that developed the squarified algorithm. So that's an open, or at least a freeware Windows tool to visualize your hard drive, like what uses a lot of space. One big thing about those tree maps is that they are really good at scalability because essentially, this is a pixel-based layout, right? And so this is a tree map of 1 million items, and that's also not terribly hard to render. And so we can really show very large trees if we care about the attributes in a tree map like that. An alternative to tree maps is the sunburst. And so sunburst is also an implicit layout and uses these kind of like pie chart-like approaches. So you start out with the root, okay, and then let's say, well, I have again my tree with 4 nodes here, with 4 leaf nodes. So this is my root. Then I partition this into 2 into two segments that correspond to the two branches from the root. And now I've made them equally sized. And then, as before, let's suppose we have the two leaves here are unevenly balanced. So we'd have something like that. And then those are even. Okay, and so I can continue splitting it up like that. And if I had more, let's say more, like an uneven hierarchy, I could continue like this. And so on. And so now here I'm visualizing in an implicit layout very well both actually the structure of the tree as well as the size of the elements. So this is kind of an implementation that's very much similar to the original implementation, where you have like this zoom out and pop out and like focus and context technique implemented with all the labeling and little indicators where you can look at there's more down the tree. And then there's of course D3 versions of that. So here is a zoomable sunburst. Just broken. Well, I'm not going to debug it now, but there are D3 implementations of that. So, what do you think? How is the sunburst compared to the tree map? Like pros and cons?
So the problem is that to actually know how big the difference between the area, the squares were easier to notice.
Yes. So the size of the squares is easier to notice than the like wedge size. So that's something that we know from pie charts. Yeah.
It's probably challenging to show a huge number of, you can't fit a million samples.
Exactly. So it's kind of like if you look, this is more interactive, right? Here you have the root and 5 levels down, but you can't really show like 16 or 50 levels down because you explicitly show the levels. Whereas in the other case, you really only show the leaves well. So here you show the hierarchy more and the relative size of the root, of the aggregated size of the folders, if you think about it in folders. But you don't show the leaf set quite as well. And so, depending on what you're trying to do, one or the other could be better. And a very simple alternative to that is the icicle plot. And it's called icicle plot because it looks like icicles hanging from a house. This is the same idea. We have a folder, and then we have subfolders here, and they're simply partitioned in layers. So that's kind of like the boring cousin of those two, but very effective actually. It's not quite as space filling. So like a million items is going to be tricky to show, but it's kind of like the simple version that works quite well. However, for some reason, I kind of personally like sunburst a lot. So this one I'm sure works because I've just tested that. So here I can zoom into any of those areas if I want to. So yeah, we talked about the pros and cons, so I'll skip over this. Let's reflect a little bit on implicit representations. Pros are they're space efficient because we don't explicitly draw edges, we don't have to worry about edge routing, about overlaps and so on. They scale up to very large graphs, especially tree maps. They're well suited to attribute-based tasks in the node set. That's kind of like what they're made for. Depending on the spatial encoding, they're also useful for topology-based tasks. So here, for example, finding the shortest path from this here to this here is fairly simple, right? I simply go down. Well, in this case, I actually have to go down all the way to the root. But if I wanted to find the connection from here to here, I simply go down to the first shared parent, and then I walk back up. So I can do pathfinding in the sunburst quite well. I can do pathfinding in the icicle plot quite well. Pathfinding in the tree map is difficult. Cons is they cannot visualize general graphs. Like you cannot find a good and an unambiguous layout like this for an unambiguous graph. You could visualize a spanning tree, like I talked about before, but you cannot visualize a general graph. Since the node positions are used to represent edges, they can no longer be freely arranged, so you cannot use a geospatial tree map easily, or you cannot use a geospatial tree map, full stop. They are, of course, useless to pursue anything related to edge attributes, because edges are just not even shown in these visualization techniques in the first place. Spatial relations such as overlap or inclusion can lead to occlusion. That is actually a con that doesn't apply to the examples that I showed, that it only applies to implicit ones, which I kind of, implicit graph layouts, which I skipped completely, so forget about that. There is, for many visualization research topics, there are these nice collections of things that people have collected, which kind of different techniques there are. This is like treevis.net, the tree visualization reference, and you can find here any like tree visualization technique ever published, including some crazy ones like, let's see, this one here. Or like this is like one of the, like an early Sunburst variant. Or yeah, there's plenty of techniques. And this links to the original papers and includes figures and BibTeX, and you can sort it by, is it explicit, is it implicit, or is it hybrid? So for example, now I'm looking at all the hybrid techniques, and I can do like sphere tree. So not all of this does make a ton of sense, but this is not the point about, this is like a catalog of everything that was done in the first place. I kind of want to conclude by talking about a couple of tools. So, of course, you guys know how to implement all of this yourself. But if you just want to quickly visualize a graph, there's a couple of tools out there that are quite helpful. There's Gephi, which is an open source project, which is used like as a general purpose graph visualization tool, a lot for social networks. That's a downloadable tool. Then there's Cytoscape. Cytoscape is kind of like the gold standard for biological network visualization. Cytoscape is really famous for having a great set of plugins for many different application scenarios. So there's the Cytoscape base software, and then you can add plugins to answer specific questions. There is Cytoscape Web, so you can export Cytoscape to some degree at least to the web. And Cytoscape Web is a JavaScript library to quickly create node link layouts. So that would be another option. And then if you're like using things, like if you're using, for example, Python, you could use NetworkX, which is kind of like a library to do kind of network visualization to some degree, but mostly about data structures for graphs, where you can run many kinds of graph algorithms. And so that concludes my lectures on graphs, and we will continue talking about maps on Thursday.